Picture this, a war without a formal declaration. Sounds intriguing, right? Let's dive into the Falklands War of 1982. Hi, I'm Leah, feeling excited today and ready to unpack a story that's got diplomacy, daring operations, and some real human stakes.
And I'm Garrett, ready to dig into some history. Welcome to Laid Back Learning with Leah and Garrett. All right, let's set the stage for this one. What led to it and how it unfolded in 1982. Here's a cool thought to kick off. I was at a naval museum a while back, and I stopped at a model of HMS Sheffield, which was a British destroyer. The exhibit talked about how it was struck by an Exocet, which is a French-built sea-skimming anti-ship missile. I remember looking at the tiny model and thinking, wow, a single missile changed so many lives and shifted how fleets think about defense. That moment pulled me down a rabbit hole on naval warfare, especially the Falklands, and not gonna lie, it stuck with me.
Let's set the scene for this one. The Falklands War was a 10-week undeclared conflict in 1982 between Argentina and the United Kingdom over the Falkland Islands, which Argentina calls the Islas Malvinas. The islands are a remote South Atlantic archipelago, and at the time they were administered by Britain as a crown colony. Today they're a self-governing British overseas territory, which just means they're under UK sovereignty, but run many of their own local affairs. The unusual part is, neither country formally declared war. So legally it sat in this gray zone where full-on fighting happened under labels like self-defense and territorial recovery rather than a formal war declaration.
Yeah, and both sides had long-standing claims. Argentina's claim, later written into its 1994 constitution, frames the islands as part of its sovereign territory. The British position emphasized continuous administration since the 1800s and the islanders' right to choose their political future, or self-determination, which in simple terms means the people living there get a say. When the crisis hit, the UK also moved fast at the United Nations and secured Security Council Resolution 502. That resolution condemned the use of force, called for Argentine withdrawal, and gave the UK diplomatic cover to act in self-defense without tackling the deeper sovereignty question.
Why avoid the sovereignty question in that UN resolution, though? That seems like the heart of it.
Totally fair question. The quick version is political math. If the UK pushed sovereignty in the text, it risked splitting votes or triggering a veto. By focusing narrowly on the breach of the UN Charter's ban on force, they got enough support, 10 votes, with the Soviet Union and China abstaining. It was a strategic choice to secure legitimacy for military moves without trying to solve the whole dispute right then.
That checks out. So big picture, Argentina hoped a quick win would rally support at home during economic turmoil and the period known as the Dirty War, which was rife with human rights abuses. The UK, meanwhile, leaned on international law and the islanders' preferences and started assembling a task force to reverse the occupation. And remember, even though this was an undeclared war, they still drew lines in the sea with exclusion zones. A total exclusion zone, or TZID, was announced on the 30th of April, meaning any aircraft or ship aiding the Argentine occupation could be attacked inside it. Okay, here we go, from the top, early days. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentina launched an amphibious landing called Operation Rosario. They quickly overran the small British garrison. Sir Rex Hunt, who was the governor of the Falklands, coordinated a brief defense with Major Mike Norman and his Royal Marines, but then surrendered to prevent further bloodshed.
The very next day, 3rd of April, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 502. Like we said, it condemned the use of force and demanded Argentine withdrawal. Diplomatically, that was huge. It put wind at Britain's back. At the same time, the UK was already shifting gears militarily.
On the 5th of April, Britain dispatched a naval task force. Operation Corporate was the code name for the overall British effort to retake the islands, directed by Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, who was the Royal Navy's overall operational commander. The fleet included 2 aircraft carriers, escorts, and lots of support ships, with troops embarked on requisitioned civilian liners as well.
There's also the political side in London. A war cabinet formed on the 6th of April, meeting daily. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher led it, but it was a tight team effort keeping diplomacy, logistics, and military operations synchronized. And a key naval voice, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, the first Sea Lord, had already pushed hard on 1st of April that the Navy could and should retake the islands. That gave the green light a lot of weight.
Meanwhile, there was intense shuttle diplomacy. Alexander Haig, the U.S. Secretary of State, bounced between London and Buenos Aires starting 8th of April with proposals. He was trying to set up an interim authority and mutual stand-down. But London insisted on Argentine withdrawal first, and Buenos Aires wanted sovereignty on the table as a precondition. So talks stalled.
Mid-April, the British also set up a critical staging base at Ascension Island, co-located with Wide Awake Airfield. The RAF moved in tankers, bombers, and fighters. The main naval task force got tuned up there for the push south. It became the logistics heartbeat for long-range operations, including those famous Vulcan bomber missions later on.
On the 30th of April, the UK announced the total exclusion zone we mentioned. That was also the day the US publicly declared support for Britain. So now you had legal justification through the UN and overt backing from Washington. The chessboard was set.
Then 1st May hit like a starter pistol. Admiral Sandy Woodward's carrier group entered the Tees. The RAF launched Black Buck 1, a long-range Vulcan raid, to drop bombs on Stanley Airfield. Sea Harriers, which were British carrier-based fighter jets, tangled with Argentine aircraft. A Dagger and a Canberra were shot down that day. It was the shift from posturing to sustained combat operations.
And at the same time, Argentina was scaling up its garrison. By early May, there were around 13,000 troops on the islands, many of them conscripts facing tough conditions. Brigadier General Mario Benjamin Menendez, who served as the military governor, was in charge on the ground. The stage was set for a very hard fight.
Okay, middle stretch. A pivotal naval moment came on the 2nd of May. HMS Conqueror, a British nuclear-powered submarine, sank the Argentine cruiser Ara General Belgrano. The Belgrano was a major surface combatant, and knocking it out eliminated the Argentine surface fleet threat. After that, most of Argentina's navy stayed in port. That gave the British task force more freedom to maneuver closer to the islands for landings and sustained ops.
But 2 days later, 4th of May, the pendulum swung. Argentine Super Endar jets fired Exocet missiles and struck HMS Sheffield. The ship was later lost, and it was the first Royal Navy warship sunk in action since the early 1900s. The Exocet, being sea-skimming, flew low to avoid radar and gave defenders very little reaction time. It was devastating and a shock to the British public.
And that tied into a British weakness: no airborne early warning aircraft, or AEW. AEW is basically an eye-in-the-sky radar plane that can see threats farther out, cue defenders, and buy them time. Without it, the British fleet had to lean on ship radars and combat air patrols from Sea Harriers. That forced some nerve-wracking tactics against low-level attackers, including Exocet carriers.
And yet, the Sea Harriers were incredibly effective. With AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles, which are heat seekers that could lock from wider angles than earlier versions, they racked up kills against incoming aircraft. Sometimes the air picture was so busy that fighter operations and shipboard missiles or anti-air guns had to be carefully deconflicted, meaning they had to coordinate so they didn't work at cross purposes. That joint force friction is pretty common under pressure.
On the Argentine side, logistics and geography were a grind. Stanley's runway was too short for fast jets, so major strikes launched from the mainland. Long flights meant lean fuel margins and barely any time over target. Pilots sometimes had to hit the first viable target and turn back fast. That limited complex strike packages and made escorting bombers or coordinating multiple waves harder.
They tried to stretch British defenses with deception too. Esquadron Phoenix, which was a civilian jet decoy squadron, flew to simulate strike aircraft and lure British Sea Harriers away. That created radar clutter and forced the British to chase ghosts. It was risky. On 7th of June, a Learjet 35A was shot down by HMS Exeter, and Vice Commodore Rodolfo de la Colina was killed. That shows how blurred lines became when civilian types flew military-style profiles.
At the same time, Argentina used Lockheed C-130 Hercules transports to run night flights, resupply in, wounded out. Flying at night or in bad weather cut detection risk, and only one Hercules was confirmed lost to British action during the war, shot down on the 1st of June while searching for the fleet in daylight. That air bridge kept the garrison going longer than many expected.
And on the islands themselves, civilians were bearing the strain. People in Goose Green were confined in a hall for almost a month. Some islanders were detained or expelled, like community leaders and a local editor, which backfired by creating negative coverage abroad. There were also reports of Argentine conscripts suffering harsh treatment from their own officers and NCOs, plus serious ration shortfalls. Those accounts became a painful post-war reckoning in Argentina.
Before we leave this middle act, one early morale boost for the British came from Operation Paraquet, the retaking of South Georgia on the 25th of April. A small force, backed by naval gunfire and after disabling the submarine R.A. Santa Fe with a swarm of helicopter attacks, got the Argentine garrison to surrender. Thatcher's response, "Just rejoice at that news," became a moment people remembered. It didn't decide the main war, but it signaled reach and resolve and helped set conditions for the amphibious phase that followed.
Endgame. After weeks of naval maneuvering, air duels, and bombardments, British amphibious landings enabled a fast ground campaign on East Falkland. The fighting on the ground was intense in the final phase, but momentum built towards Stanley, the main settlement.
On the 14th of June, 1982, Argentine forces surrendered in Stanley. That ended 74 days of hostilities. The islands returned to British control, and there was a push right away for humanitarian relief, repatriating prisoners and mine clearance. The UK also reinforced defenses and restored the civil administration rapidly.
The human cost was heavy. In total, 649 Argentine military personnel and 255 British military personnel were killed, along with 3 Falkland Islanders. Losses came from sinkings at sea, air attacks, ground combat, and the brutal maritime environment. Even with the islanders' civilian fatalities being low, it underscored how vulnerable a small community is in a war zone.
Politically, the shockwaves were huge. In Argentina, patriotic fervor at the start gave way to outrage after defeat. Protests helped topple the military junta. Leaders like General Leopoldo Galtieri, Admiral Jorge Anaya, and Air Brigadier Basilio Lamidoso, and the country moved toward democratization. The war stayed a powerful cultural touchpoint there, intertwined with memory of the dictatorship.
In the UK, the successful campaign bolstered the Conservative government and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's leadership. The next year's election saw a larger majority. Defense debates also shifted, with the war highlighting the value of naval capabilities that had been up for cuts. But culturally, the conflict didn't loom as large in Britain in the long run as it did in Argentina.
Diplomatically, the two countries restored relations in 1989 through talks in Madrid without changing their stances on sovereignty. That normalization allowed practical cooperation, things like flights and fisheries, while they agreed to disagree on the core claim. In 1994, Argentina's new constitution reaffirmed its claim to the islands as part of a province by law, but on the ground, the Falklands remained a self-governing British overseas territory.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about the RAF's Black Buck raids. These were ultra-long-range Vulcan bomber missions from Ascension to hit Stanley Airfield and radars. The controversy is whether they were strategically impactful or just massive fuel-heavy stunts. I lean toward saying they mattered psychologically and as deterrents, showing reach. Even if the physical damage to the runway's edge was modest, the signal to Buenos Aires was, "We can touch your forces that far south." That has value in a conflict where perception shapes choices.
I get that, but I'm kind of on the other side. The tanking plan that fed a single Vulcan was like a logistical Rube Goldberg machine. We're talking Victor tankers refueling other tankers just to get one bomber to drop a string of bombs. The direct tactical effect seems limited. Later, Argentine and British sources questioned whether the raids really forced fighter redeployments. So yeah, big statement, but resource-wise, it might have been more symbolism than substance compared to what Sea Harrier patrols achieved day in, day out.
Why not go for both angles, though? If the Vulcan runs slightly disrupted repair cycles at the airfield and messed with Argentine planning, Even for a short window, that could have eased pressure on the British fleet. Psychological pressure counts. When commanders worry a bomber might show up again, it changes their risk calculus. Even a little uncertainty can ripple through scheduling and air defense postures.
True, uncertainty has a cost. But if you're making a cold trade-off, the Sea Harriers and the submarines were the war-winning tools. The carriers launched continuous caps, and the subs basically parked the Argentine Navy. If those tanker sorties and crews had been focused elsewhere, say, persistent reconnaissance or supporting other missions, maybe you reduce risk to the fleet more efficiently. I'm not saying Black Buck was pointless. I'm just saying it sat on the symbolic side of the ledger more than the tactical.
Real talk, I love that we can hold both truths lightly here. It was costly and complex, but it also told a story about British capability at long range. When wars hinge on narratives as much as numbers, those stories can shape behavior. I guess we land on tactically limited, psychologically useful.
Pop culture time. The conflict's been explored in loads of books and documentaries. If folks want deep dives, historians like Lawrence Friedman, Max Hastings, and Simon Jenkins have written influential accounts. Each brings a different lens: official history, frontline reporting, and political framing.
And I'd love to see a film that threads personal stories from both sides. An Argentine conscript dealing with supply shortages and fear, a British pilot juggling fuel and split-second shoot-or-don't-shoot decisions, a Falkland Islander family confined under occupation. Keep the focus on choices ordinary people had to make. That human angle, honestly, hits deeper than hardware. Counterfactual moment. What if both countries had accepted the UN proposal on 18 May 1982 for mutual withdrawal under a UN administrator with future sovereignty talks under UN auspices? In plain terms, everybody steps back. A neutral steward runs local affairs for a while, and you negotiate later. No ground campaign.
If that had happened, Argentina's junta might have bought time. Without the definitive defeat, domestic outrage may not have spiked as hard or as fast. Maybe the transition to democracy still comes, but not on the same timeline. On the British side, you lose the clear-cut military success that bolstered the government's standing. The next year's politics could have looked very different without a battlefield victory shaping public perception.
And on the islands, a UN administrator could have lowered immediate risks, but also introduced uncertainty for the locals. Remember, many Falkland Islanders strongly preferred British sovereignty. If negotiations later moved forward without explicit self-determination language, that might have felt like a step away from their wishes. Even if life normalized, the political anxiety might have lingered.
Internationally, an accepted UN plan would have showcased multilateral crisis management. The UK still would have had significant support, but without the war's proof of concept for expeditionary capability. Argentina could have framed the pause as a diplomatic win, keeping the sovereignty narrative alive. Bottom line, a lot of the losses would have been spared, but you might also lock in a longer, murkier dispute.
So there's your big picture, from an undeclared war to a hard-won cease of hostilities, with legal and human threads in between. Stay curious. There's always more to learn.
All right, that ties it up nicely. Thanks for hanging with us, and yeah, let's keep exploring the history that shapes how we think today.